everyone. Welcome to this podcast episode, Psychic Deaths Exploring Jungian Concept as it is applicable in child therapy. Today, we are going to explore the very exciting topic of the shadow as a well-known Jungian concept, and we are going to discuss how does this relate to children in therapy, children's behavior, and child therapy in terms of how do we see the shadow in the play of a child, in the playroom, what is the shadow, and what need to be done with the shadow in order to help a child. So the shadow consists in the psyche of every human being, and also in the psyche of children that come into therapy, and in the psyches of their caregivers, which might be the parents, the foster parents, or the teachers. Now, how does the shadow form? Whatever the ego consciousness denies, develop in shadow. So when the ego rejects something, sometimes a certain trait in a child, like being selfish, very egocentric, think about when they're younger, might have been in ego consciousness for a short while, and then the child sometimes rudely get the message that this trait is not okay. So then it is suppressed to the unconscious, where it keep on having power and controlling the child's behavior. So the shadow consists out of traits and qualities, both positive qualities and negative qualities, that are incompatible with the conscious ego. In other words, for one or other reason, it's not allowed on conscious level. So this can be positive or negative traits. For example, a child might have an extremely sadistic part, or there might be an undiscovered talent in the psyche of a child. So the qualities that we hate in others, that irritates us in others, or that we admire in others, are often the qualities that lives in our own psyche. Now, in terms of a child, you might listen to a child telling you about other kids that extremely irritate them, judging other kids, or, share something that really creates negative emotion in themselves about others. And in terms of the shadow in the Jungian psychology, the thing that irritates us in others are often something that is also disowned in our own shadow. But the same is also true for a positive characteristic. So sometimes you might find that a child is extremely attracted to something like a hero, an idol, a very good actor or actress or singer or sports person. And that might be because a child have that same talent in his or her unconscious, but it is undiscovered. So it has still, you can say it's gold with dust on it. So the ego consciousness, the conscious part of the personality, cannot control the shadow. The ego is quite unaware of the shadow, and that is why it's called shadow, because it is suppressed in the personal unconscious. Rather than seeing the shadow as a thing, it can be referred to as psychological traits or qualities that are in the personal unconscious of the child. And these qualities have been suppressed to the personal unconscious because of cognitive or emotional dissonance. And like I said earlier, the child somewhere got the message that it is not okay to have these qualities. So what happens then? The contents of shadow might change. This depends on the degree of the ego's attitude and the level of defensiveness in the child. So often the shadow contains qualities that are against the moral conventions of society. So it's all those negative traits and sins, sin that is judged, like being selfish, being envious, being aggressive, being hostile, being violent, and so forth. So the protective and self-serving activities of the shadow are often carried out in the symbolic dark because on conscious level, it would create a moral conflict. Think about a child who steals something sweet from another child's bag at school. But when confronted with this, the ego or the conscious part of the child's personality would severely deny that it was him or her. And the possibility of such an act, the act of stealing, is often in strong contrast with the child's morals on conscious level. So, would a child be able to admit doing this when confronted? What would influence if a child is able to admit that? We know, and I see that in my therapy practice, that sometimes some children just find it much easier to say, I did steal the cookie. I did take something, and they can talk and discuss about what happened. Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes the reason is unconscious, but they can admit that they've done that. Other times, children will brutally deny that they've done that because of their defensiveness. Now, because of the anxiety that goes with the possibility of admitting to have that shadow trait. And sometimes also because of the consciousness of the harsh punishment or rejection that will follow from parents or society or teachers if they admit that they have done that. So sometimes it's something that they cannot admit to themselves, that they have a part that can do that thing, like steal or being violent or sadistic. And sometimes it's because of fear of the judgment and the fierce judgment of society. So the more conscious child is the child, that will might be able to admit that after sometimes a long period of therapy where the child also feels safe in the presence of the therapist to be vulnerable, to say what he or she struggles with. And that's actually a very, very good moment in therapy once we can get to, okay, so these are things that I think I'm good at, but these are things that I'm not proud of, but it still lives in my psyche. The ego defenses against shadow awareness is often very effective, and I find that it's only children who have been involved in a longer therapeutic process that would have the developed ego strength to allow parts of the shadow in consciousness without the fear of anxiety or extreme shame. Let's take the example of a child who has showed sexualized behavior towards another child on the school ground. Often this is repetition compulsion, so the child is repeating what has been done to the child previously. Often that trauma is suppressed so the child don't understand their own sexualized behavior. And I find that adults will often ask the question, why did you do that? And the child don't know. The child sincerely don't know why they did it. Often this behavior is confronted in a cruel, insensitive, punishing way. And the child then experiences even more shame and anxiety. The sexual abuse of the child is often suppressed in the unconscious, and the only defense in terms of the child's own sexualized behavior towards another child is denial, and then often a fierce refusal to discuss and explore this further in therapy, especially if the adults in the child's lives reaction was very severe and of a harsh nature. So I find that when children are then brought to therapy, they just refuse to talk about what happened. Then let's think about how other shadow parts can manifest in child therapy. So let's say, for example, a child grew up in a very, very neglectful, abusive, or deprived environment. So this the thoughts, the history of what happened in the child's life is suppressed in the person unconscious. And maybe there's an extremely angry part in the child's unconscious because of what happened. Let's even say it's a bit a sadistic part. Now, there's a quote in Jungian psychology that say that which is not made conscious will be repeated, and we will call it fate. So what might play out in the child's play is, for example, that the child project the sadism on the therapist. For example, saying to the therapist, I'm going to take you to jail. Here in jail, you're going to have hardship. You're not going to have any food. You're not going to have anything to drink. You're going to have it cold. Maybe putting out some toys in the playroom that and say, these are all the people, the animals that are going to threaten you. They're going to laugh at you for being in jail. They're going to tease you, and you're never going to get out there. So there is a shadow sadistic part in the child because of what happened to the child. And in the therapy that can be seen because it is now projected on the therapist. Then I'm thinking about an example of a child who very frequently, when he came into therapy, used my yellow school bus and said that this bus is the naughty bus. And very unpredictable, out of the blue, the child will take the naughty bus, and then the naughty bus would start to do very naughty things in the playroom. For example, he would throw the bus to other toys and act destructively and do a lot of projected things that actually he feels like doing. And he's carrying the projection of I'm naughty, but it's in shadow, and therefore it is projected on the naughty bus, because as soon as the naughty bus start doing the naughty things, it's not me who's doing that. I'm projecting that shadow part on the bus. And again, the therapist can see what is stored in the shadow, in the unconscious of the child, by looking at what is projected in the play of the child. And as long as it is projected, it means it's not owned on conscious level, and it is controlling the child. But something somewhere in that child, something happened that the child started believing he is naughty. And most probably it was words that has been said to the child, and the child suppressed that part. It might be that the child have a part that's very willful and don't want to listen and don't want to obey authority. But now that part is suppressed to the unconscious and projected in the therapy. A child might wish to hide a violent trait due to parental pressures. For example, a violent trait might be suppressed to the unconscious when the condemning adults are around. So as soon as they are adults, or as long as they are adults who are around and that will definitely not approve or that will punish the child when that part comes out, the child will not show the violent part. But as soon as the parents are not around, the child will go and do something violent. Maybe I had a child that strangled another child, or doing something hurtful to the new baby brother or sister. Or this is not specifically a violent part, but I'm thinking about a child that felt very neglected by the parents. Parents were very busy. So the child went and he he create a bit of chaos in a room in the home and then accuse someone else of doing that. The child knew he'd do that, but the shadow part wasn't shown in the presence of the parents. So sometimes it's even difficult for the parents to understand that the child have this part. So in terms of a violent part, for example, or a sadistic part, threats and hidings and humiliation will not rehabilitate or change this part in the unconscious, the shadow part in the unconscious of the child. it will only drive that part more into the unconscious, where it will control the child more. Violence is an over assertion, for example, of power due to debilitating feelings of powerlessness. Now, the opposite that the child is or has experienced in his or her life. And what actually needs to happen to remedy the situation is that the child's feelings of powerlessness need to be addressed with empathy to change the violent part and to make it less necessary to have the opposite of the powerlessness in the unconscious. Oh, here's another example. A generous and fun-loving and optimistic child might have parents who are very negative, very depressed, or even emotionally very cold. The child is then almost brainwashed into rejecting this positive personality traits and have to live out the same parts that the parents are living out and have to suppress such a big golden part of his or her own personality. It's almost like a form of psychic suicide, you can say. And again, what needs to happen to help that child heal is to find an environment for the child where the child can live out the optimistic, fun-loving part. Often in teenage years, those kids can get very rebellious and they constantly want to go out and spend time where there's fun and the opposite of the darkness and the somber atmosphere that they experience at home. It's also possible that the child, for example, has identified with a scapegoat role in the family and show oppositional and defiant behavior on conscious level. This behavior might have a certain function in the family system. For example, as long as I show this difficult, defined behavior, and the school principal or the teacher have to phone my parents every day, the focus is not on my parents' marriage problem, and I can make sure that they do not divorce because I forced my parents to be busy with my, I almost want to say, stuff and behavioral trouble the whole time. And this is done quite unconsciously. So the child might show overtly defined and aggressive behavior, but actually, and in the shadow, might be a very empathetic and sensitive soul. So because the shadow is in the unconscious, the shadow is often projected onto others. A child that, for example, blames everyone else of being extremely selfish and being irritated by it might carry a very selfish part in his or her shadow. All right, so it is clear then that shadow is a part of the personality that we strive to hide or have never known. It often includes feelings of weakness and inferiority. And we can see material from the personal unconscious and the shadow in the play of the child, in art projections of a child, and in drawings and puppetry. An example, for example, are the bad guys that the child plays out good guys, bad guys every week in the sand tray. The bad guys might refer to the part in the child that feel he or she is bad or is blaming him or herself for the trauma in his life, but it's projected now on the bad guys in the play of the child. Or a child that plays out a theme of extreme control in the playroom often have that controlling part in the unconscious, but we deny that if it is discussed on conscious level, if the child's old enough even to discuss that. In the play of the child, you might see a cruel, cold character that wants to control everyone else. The more the shadow is integrated in consciousness, the more the personal unconscious diminishes, and when transformed, 90% of the shadow is actually pure gold. Now, needless to say that there are many adults that never move to the phase of shadow integration, and therefore, on the level of a child can also only do this amount of shadow work at a specific age. Young kids, preschool kids, will project what is shadow in the play, but will not necessarily very rarely be able to own that shadow projection and to integrate it on conscious level. Whereas a teenager might be able to identify a harsh, a cold, a selfish, a jealous, aggressive, a violent, and oppositional part in themselves, and might, when they feel safe in the therapy room, they might discuss it with you and like talk about that and work. I almost want to say to soften it a bit on conscious level. Some children are threatened with harsh punishment if they show a part of their shadow. For example, being selfish or cruel towards a sibling. And this just often lead to suppression of a shadow part that builds up enormous power in the unconscious and then erupt like a volcano in the child's life from time to time. And everyone can be very surprised in terms of what is this? Or we don't do this type of behavior in our home. And, like it just creates more and more shame for the child. So the goal in therapy, in child therapy, when we work according to the Jungian principles, would be to provide the environment and atmosphere of safety in the therapy room so that the child can project and later on when they're older, own their shadow parts. Once these parts are integrated on conscious level, the child might be able to make use of other parts to manage the shadow part in the psyche. For example, it's one thing to deny that you ever get jealous or envious. It's another thing to feel the feelings of envy, to own it, to give it a place, to maybe sculpt it or draw it or build it with clay or build it in a sand tray, and then move towards, okay, what is this? Maybe where does it come from? And how can I manage that? I'm thinking about a teenager that her sister was born just 1 year after her. There was a 1 year difference, and she struggled a lot to share her mother at such a young age. So when she was a teenager, she was absolutely able to own the fact that she was very angry and jealous when she had to share her mother as a younger child. That she's jealous towards the sister, and she could also admit what bad things or cruel things she sometimes do when the jealousy or feelings of jealousy overwhelm her. The interesting fact is the moment when she could get it out in the open in an environment that is unconditionally accepted, it the relationship with the sister improved tremendously because now she could also start accessing other parts like, well, there's also a part of my sister that I like, and sometimes she's caring, and sometimes we can connect. I'm not overpowered by this jealousy that was for such a long time stuffed up in my unconscious. So young kids who are still in the process of ego development, like preschoolers, are very much at the mercy of shadow parts of adults in their environment. They will not necessarily be able to identify that a parent see them as the ego extension and the parent want to live their dreams through the child, and they have to carry the public image for the specific system, or whatever unintegrated shadow parts the parent has that the parent integrate on them. So there can be so many shadow parts in a parent, and it is a well-known fact that which is not integrated in terms of the parental psyche is often the shadow parts that a child has to carry. I'm thinking about a child client who um, had this absolute compulsion that one day he has to work hard, and one day when he grow up so that he can take care of his parents. Now, that was something that he picked up in the shadow of the parents. The parents never said it, but it was an unsaid implicit expectation that we are good towards you now so that you can take care of us as soon as you're grown up. So that would be something that would place a child quite at mercy of the shadow of the parents. Like I said, teenagers are in a developmental stage where they can start to see the shadow of other people in their environment. Okay, so gifted children are also often at the mercy of bullies and envy of others, and often get the message from young that, like there's something wrong with that too. It's not okay to be gifted. And, like we are going to really act very rudely towards you because you are talented, be it in academics, be it in sport, be it in cultural art activities, or sometimes even more than one of this. And again, that might lead to the fact that a gifted child suppress this gold within to the shadow and refuse to develop that any further. What is the message? The message that a child got is that if you dare living out this part of you, this true, authentic part of you, you will be blamed, you will be punished, and you will be bullied. So it's just not safe, or you will be exploited. Whatever the case, a child with a very kind and soft-hearted nature is often the child who is exploited, is often the child who is bullied. So the child might also learn that, like this part of me is just no good, and it just leads to hardship and pain. So when we talk about shadow parts in a child, now I'm thinking about a child that was very gentle and soft-hearted, a boy. He was about 4 years old, and he had quite a strong connection with his feeling part. And he entered my playroom and he looked at my dollhouse and he said, "That is just for girls." I realized that he has a need to play in that dollhouse, and I said, "You think it's just for girls, but in here you can play with anything you like." He didn't even look at that dollhouse and during the rest of the session. In the next session, he put a string of beads around his neck, came in, and he said, "I am now an auntie, and therefore I can play in the dollhouse." And I said, "In here you can play with the dollhouse." In further exploration later, it came out that the child's dad had the same type of personality as a child, and he was teased and bullied a lot for showing the soft, warm-hearted, soft-hearted, empathetic feeling nature. And he was also, he was teased in terms of his gender identity. And he never worked through that pain in the shadow of "there's something wrong with you," the shame. So now, when his child was showing the same nature, the dad, to all costs, wanted to protect the child of not experiencing the pain. But what he did is that whenever the boy, gravitate just a little bit towards the feminine in terms of playing with his sister, playing dolls with his sister, or doing anything that reminds the dad of his own pain, the child was restricted, that he's not allowed to do that. And that's actually what he played out in the playroom when he said, like the dollhouse is just for girls. The wonderful thing is that he made a plan. If I make myself a bit girlish, then I can play in the dollhouse. And the good news is that this can be discussed with the parents. This can be discussed with the parents, and hopefully they will be able to move to insight in terms of what is in my own shadow that I've projected on my child. The mere fact of, for example, saying, well, I never want my child to suffer in the same way I suffered, is often also an unintegrated shadow board where parents will then go to the opposite of that, and they would, for example, overly spoil a child and don't allow a child to take any responsibility for their own choices. So the bottom line is that when we work with a child, we must always take the shadow of the parent into account. The shadow expectations, the shadow unlived life of the parent, the way in which a child can become an ego extension of the parent. So the child have to excel in certain areas so that the parent feel good about him or herself. And we need to encourage parents, either through therapy process or in whatever way, to deal with their own shadow, to become aware of that and to integrate it in their own ego consciousness so that children don't have to carry the burden of the parent shadow, which often we see is the overburdened child, like the boy that felt at a very young primary school age, I have to take care of my parents. And you can see that a child that takes that vow on themselves cannot be a child because the child is forced to deal with adult issues and adult responsibility way too young. So we want to make parents aware of shadow aspects in themselves and be gentle with that and normalize it. We all have shadow, and how can we integrate so that the child can be separate and we can assist the child without our shadow projection as a parent to develop in their own unique, authentic being. And then in the playroom, through the child's projections, through the themes that the child play out, be it power, be it control, be it helplessness, be it a sadistic part, a violent part, through that we can take note of a possible shadow part that's living in the child's unconscious and that is projected on the toys and the material in the playroom. And as the child grows old enough and becomes stronger in ego, where the child can also take back that shadow part. I'm reminded of a boy who was about 12 years old in a children's home that struggled a lot with aggression, as it is often with traumatized children. And he would specifically at dinner or so, when he gets angry, he would grab a knife and he want to stab another child, like almost impulsively. And we did a lot of work in the playroom, but he grew to a point where he was not blaming the other kids anymore. He could move towards look at what they are doing to getting angry, grabbing the knife, stop and say, look at what I want to do. Now my aggressive part is activated, my violent part is activated. Okay, which other part can I use to calm down that activated, angry, aggressive part? And it was the end of the problem. So in terms of children, we can observe the shadow in their play, we can observe shadow in dreams, we can observe shadow in any type of projection that child do in the playroom, also in sand projections, parts in the child, wounded parts, or parts that the child can just not allow or honor on conscious level. And the goal would always be to normalize that and provide a space for that, so that it can be transformed. Where, as I said earlier, 90% of it can become gold in unconscious level once it is transformed. Thank you.